come to the panel sessions of the conference. Before that, here are some housekeeping reminders. There will be a Q&A session after the speaker's sharing in each session. We welcome participants on site to write down any questions you have on paper and to pass it to our colleagues. Participants joining by Zoom, you may submit your questions in the Q&A box during or after the presentations.
Let us start Section 1, Building a Peaceful and Fair Multipolar World to Advance Economies. Please allow me to introduce the moderator of this section, Mr. Nick Chen, Chairman of the 7th Belt and Road Conference Organizing Committee.
Please also welcome the following speakers to join Mr. Chan for the discussion. Mrs. Elena BORISENKO, Deputy Chairperson of the Board of Management, Gazprombank JSC. Mr. Daniel Fung, SBS, SC, KC, JP, former Solicitor General of Hong Kong, Chairman of United Nations Peace and Development Foundation, President of International Law Association Hong Kong Chapter, and Specialist in China-United States relations. And Ms. Tracy WUT, China Managing Partner and Head of M&A, Hong Kong, Baker & McKenzie. Our moderator and speaker, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nicole. Max, thank you so much. President, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming today. Welcome to the 7th Belt and Road Conference organized by the Law Society of Hong Kong. In today's session, we will talk more about how to make peace and how we have a multipolar world. My name is Nick Chen, Chairman of the Organizing Committee. On behalf of the committee, I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'm also Director of ELCO, Hong Kong Regional Arbitration Center. ELCO, Asian African Legal Consultative Organization, is an international intergovernmental organization with 48 countries as member states. And it was established in 1956, and now we have 48 members. And we want to usher in a new era of growth in economy, and also to help prevent, resolve disputes. 48 countries, right? 95% are active members of the Belt and Road Initiative. The topic, building a peaceful and fair multipolar world to advance economies. We have three very distinguished speakers as introduced by our MCs. Now, with the view of making this an interactive, engaging discussion, the fellow panelists have agreed to forego their well-prepared PowerPoint. We're going to go straight dive into some discussions. Ready? All right. Our presidency of China has called on the world to build a community with a shared future for human. Looking at the world today, the global south, with more than 2/3 of the population in the world, it's on the rise, with more say and influence in global affairs and becoming a powerful force in supporting and maintaining multipolarity. Can I ask, ask all of you, what is the fundamental idea of multipolarity? Are we building a global community of a shared future? Who would like to go first?
Nick, if you don't mind, I'll just kick off and then
please do.
Let the other speakers submit their particular positions. But I think multipolarity is a emerging reality in the world. I mean, the days of unipolarity, which I suppose you could date from the fall of the Berlin Wall to maybe September 11th, then it became bipolarity. And now, of course, the world is kind of fragmenting because of pushback from the United States and a little bit from Europe as to pressures for onshoring, friendshoring, and so on. But the global south, as you mentioned, 90% of which is within the Belt and Road region, is not, as it were, passive in all this. In fact, the global south has found its voice, and the most recent ventilation of that was in Baku at COP29, where I spoke at the opening, but I'll mention that later as to what happened in Baku and the significance of that. But I think the reality of a emerging voice from the global south is a much belated development in global affairs. And I think it will lead to greater equity in terms of assertion of rights, in terms of protection of rights, and protection of rights including those of indigenous people, including those of raw materials, natural resources producing countries, so that the value is not just captured or at one stage kind of monopolized by the North. I think we are looking at a world with increasing equality, increasing equity.
Thank you, Daniel. Tracy.
Yeah, echo that. And I think for me, multipolarity also, some of the fundamental principles include really cooperation, right? And really have a more balanced legal representation, by all nations, as, Daniel has mentioned, not just probably from Western Hemisphere, but now increasingly from, global South. This also gives opportunity, I think, for a lot of nations to work together, in areas like climate change, and I'm sure we'll hear more from Daniel, economic inequality, and human rights. It actually also calls for, more inclusive legal framework, and also understanding the differences of each other's framework, because, they may not all gel together, they're bound to be conflict. But it calls for, really nations, and also lawyers, like ourselves, like a lot of them, us in the room, working together. I would just, explain to Daniel my own journey. Next year will be my 30 years with my current firm, Baker McKenzie, and
child labor from birth. Yes.
Well, even as a child, I wish. But I started actually, working on single market matters, China, because, when I started, that is where actually foreign investments go. But these days, for the last 10 years, the matters we're working on, BRIC countries, and the Belt and Road, countries definitely. But increasingly, you could actually be doing, work in one single jurisdiction, but there, implications like beyond, even that single jurisdiction. It calls for, honestly, lawyers to be, like smarter and actually more knowledgeable beyond, a single jurisdiction. Elena, maybe I'll pass on to you.
Elena is the deputy chairman of Gazprombank, the third largest bank in Russia.
Yeah.
What is your view from Russia on this?
Thank you so much. I agree with my distinguished colleagues that multipolarity is our reality even now. And the main word for multipolarity, I think, is respect. Because multipolarity is the recognition and respect for diverse world order where multiple centers of power coexist, each contributing to global governance. And that is not easy changes that our planet sees right now. And when we're talking about challenges for multipolarity, we see that the absolutely different resources, unequal situation with the quality of life of population of different countries, different national interests, sometimes struggle against this really peaceful coexisting and respecting each other. But the progress that we see in the recent days can be seen either within the declaration after the BRICS conference in Kazan that was just recently in Russia, and demonstrated the real readiness of different countries for dialogue and finding solutions. And I think these, as well as the discussions within the Paris agreements that I'm sure today we'll talk a lot, are very important.
Elena, you used to work in the Ministry of Justice, right, in the Russian Federation. You know, what perspective can you share on, are we building a shared common future for humanity?
You know, I had a wonderful teacher. Unfortunately, he passed away. He was the person who established really in Russia the system of commercial courts. He always said that we have to, he always reminded that the law is the art of fairness and kindness. And we have to serve this art. And as soon as we do it, that is a possibility to have such proper solution. And when I work in the Minister of Justice, and my colleagues work right now in the Minister of Justice, and I'm sure that practically justice all over the world, we do believe that legal profession and can do a lot to find proper mechanism and proper regulations and find the connection between morality, ethic, and rules. And that is the only key to go to the real mechanism that can provide proper understanding, proper solutions, and what is much more important maybe, proper execution of the solutions.
Well, you've all shared, from your perspective, what are the fundamentals of a multipolarity. But how important is it that we have a multipolar world as opposed to a bipolar or unipolar world? Daniel, maybe?
I think the moral case for multipolarity is self-defining. Because in a world with 193 sovereign states which are members of the United Nations, clearly it makes no sense for one or two countries to dictate to the rest of the world. That is the antithesis of fairness and justice that we all talked about and Elena emphasized just now. Moreover, I think it's inherently unfair and maybe morally repugnant that 4% of the world's population controls nearly 60% of the world's wealth. That is also an antithesis of justice and fairness. Now, I'm not advocating, I don't think anybody advocates for a world where everybody has exactly the same amount of wealth. I mean, that kind of utopian vision, I don't think can be achieved, definitely not in my lifetime, and it may not necessarily be the end object of the exercise. But I think a fairer sharing of wealth, resources, and a legitimate voice in actually articulating the needs of the Global South is compelling. Not least because if you have inbuilt structural unfairness in distribution of wealth and resources, then the entire system is not self-sustaining. And if it's not self-sustaining, the object of building a world of peace and justice cannot be achieved. So the moral case, as well as the rational case for that, I think is unimpeachable. I don't think anybody can legitimately advance a case where wealth remains in the 4% of those population, or that, in fact, even within that 4% of the world's population, the wealth is controlled by the 0.01% of that subset. That makes no sense because it's not sustainable. Obviously, we want to build a world where justice and fairness exists, and it can continue.
Daniel, are you saying you're not advocating to take from the 4%, but you're advocating for the other 96% to do better somehow?
Absolutely, because I firmly believe the world that we live in is not a zero-sum game. It's not as if we spread the wealth, therefore the 4% gets poorer. I don't believe that, because the pie is actually growing. We've seen that. Just from history, specifically economic history. And we've seen that from the 4 industrial revolutions that we've witnessed, and the 4th industrial revolution we're living through in our own lifetime. So the degree of exponential growth in productivity is there to be unleashed. So with new technology, with AI, as I'm sure we'll come to, and other revolutions in productivity, the pie is growing, and I suspect is growing exponentially. And I think beyond that, the greatest existential challenge to humankind and the biosphere is climate change. And that's a point for which an organization or an event like COP and COP29 exists. And most countries in the world subscribe to COP29, even the United States. Therefore, I think that compelling need for cooperation and collaboration amongst humanity and humankind is there. We just have to seize that opportunity, and we should not deny the logic, rationality, and fairness of doing so.
Thank you, Daniel. Elena?
I totally agree. I just wanted to add that these differences that was mentioned by Mr. Fung shows that there is no one-size solution for all the countries, for all the questions, all the issues. And the main thing is to take into account national interests and conditions for any inclusive decision making. That is, that requires to be very attentive for the circumstances of and national interests of each countries, and finding this win-win solution for the achieving global approaches. So this difference just make this decision-making difficult, but if we find the way how to negotiate it, that will be really, really possibility to change the conflict way of living on the planet to the coexisting and peaceful.
I agree. I think in a multipolar world, we envisage that there will be more diverse diverse range of legal influences to shape the international law, because it's only through consultation and consensus, reaching, that you would have a more inclusive body of laws that can adapt to the differences of geographies and cultures, and in the longer term more sustainable given the nuance of and complexities now, right, of politics. I mean, drawing from my own personal experience, I sit also in an Asia management team, and we have money centers, in Asia, like, Hong Kong, like Singapore. But we also work with colleagues, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam. And oftentimes in our discussions, and I feel in a way we're also trying to build a multipolar world, even in law firm management. Because oftentimes, they will tell us, okay, this rule that we apply for money centers may not work, like in other, offices. So it's through discussion they try to work out, standards. And I do think for multipolar world, that should be the goal too. That international standards that apply to all, but adapting to also local differences. So I think those in the room might have similar experience. It could be like even China. I think Hong Kong working with China a lot. There are differences. So I do think the consensus reaching, the negotiation that Elena mentioned, I think it's critical in reaching and it actually in the long run will be more sustainable system.
Following on that, do you think the International Office for Mediation is something you support?
Absolutely. I think both mediation and arbitration, other forms of ADR, are absolutely essential for ensuring a peaceful resolution of disputes. And I think the experience that we've had in Hong Kong since 1986, when the Arbitration Center was first mooted and later established, is eloquent testimony to the efficacy of that system. And indeed, arbitration is exploding globally, not just here, and it's been very successfully established in mainland China with CTAC some 30 years ago. And I don't think anybody would argue that arbitration is either declining or will go into reverse. On the contrary, it's expanding very healthily, and not just in this part of the world, but we see that in the Middle East, where I'm sure many people in this room have been visiting with increasing frequency. So the centers for dispute resolution we see in Dubai, in Abu Dhabi, even in Riyadh, are expanding, and we see that also in Central Asia, in Astana, in Almaty, and so on. So I fully support the proposition, Nick, that you mentioned, and I suspect very few people would wish to argue against that.
Elena?
I absolutely support this idea, and I'm sure that mediation and arbitration are very important elements of the real trust in the possibility of the executions of a solution that will be made within the any of the agreements decisions. And I can say that I recently got acquainted with the, for example, Alcor Arbitration Center, and was very much impressed how it works and how to support arbitration in Global South, and how important it is for promoting this idea of arbitration and mediation. And I can say that in Russia we do also have some arbitration centers. We are very connected with Shanghai, with SIAC, with Hong Kong Arbitration Center. But I think that this collaboration between arbitration center and mediation center is also very important for proper solutions. And I think that is the field of improvement for our legal contribution to the global challenges.
On the topic of multipolarity, let's talk about the elephant in the room, and not talking about the president there, I'm kidding, tall figure. The elephant in the room is perhaps the recent US elections. Daniel is one of the leading experts in the world on US-China relationship. How do you think, or fellow panelists, how has the election results changed or may change trade? And how affect client relationships?
Yes, I'm sure it's no surprise to everybody that the recent US election results poses challenges to the global trade system. But it doesn't mean that overnight it disappears. It doesn't, because the supply chains for goods and services are so well embedded in the international system. And those supply chains have been reinforced 30 years ago with the fall of the Berlin Wall, which I mentioned, that it's almost impossible to unravel those supply chains. In fact, the people and individuals in the upcoming Trump administration, and we've seen a number of the nominations made, including that of Elon Musk as the Secretary for Government Efficiency, etc. I mean, all those people understand the value and the irreplaceability of supply chains. You can't just tear it all apart. And even if you do your best, it's not going to happen overnight. On the contrary, US-China trade has never been higher in the past year, despite tariffs originally imposed by the first Trump administration and reinforced by the Biden administration. Now, if we take the production of Tesla vehicles, mostly in China, which are then supplied to the rest of the world, we see how difficult it is to unravel. Now, it doesn't mean that attempts will be made to chip away at that, but I suspect what we will find are replacement supply chains plus maintenance of existing supply chains, which mean that the international system will continue. I think it's absolutely impossible for any one country, no matter how self-sufficient, not the US, not People's Republic of China, to be 100% self-sufficient. It's not possible. And no one can deny that. So even on matters like climate change, of which I'm sure there are many climate deniers in the Trump administration and elsewhere too, the US was present at COP29. So there was a US pavilion, much smaller than the China pavilion, much less well attended, because of course the Green Revolution is running full steam ahead in China, not in the United States. Nevertheless, the US is still part of that system. I suspect it will remain so, and in fact the recent appointment or announcement of a nomination by Mr. Trump of a US representative to the United Nations underscores that point. I mean, if the US were to turn its back on the rest of the world, it will not work, definitely not work for the US, and even Mr. Trump nominated an ambassador to the United Nations. I mean, that speaks volumes. So it underscores the difference between the political rhetoric that comes from the mouth of politicians as opposed to the absolute reality on the ground.
Elena, what about from Russia? President Putin at the Eastern Economic Forum openly were asked and candidly said he supports Biden, but Biden's not running, so he supports Harris. Now the result is Trump won. Does that change anything from a multipolar world perspective?
I think in the multipolar world, the main principle that nobody really interferes in the inner affairs. And I think this respect to this inner affairs is very important. And I agree that in the multipolar world, national interest is important, but there are global challenges that doesn't depend on the exact persons that represents one country or another before these challenges. And maybe I'm too optimistic, maybe, but that is my real trust that a truly, in truly multipolar world, any restriction on access to resources, finance and technology will be unworkable. And even if anybody wants to do something just to make a barrier, that is very short-term period, because the level of technological development, the level of the multipolar relations will show that that is really very losing situation when you just want to put the barrier. And it is much more efficient to have a common goals and find your national interests in these global strategies. And in this case, I do believe that in the very near future we will see the positive things globally. And in this case, but the respect of the INFS and not interference is, I think, one of the main principles of the multipolar world.
Tracy, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, maybe adding to your earlier question also, Daniel, like, with the US election and particularly what it means, like, for businesses, and you focus on trade and, I'm not an expert on US-China relations, although our US colleagues have also helpfully issued an alert, so you can look it up on LinkedIn, I'll post it. I think tariffs, of course, is expected to increase substantially. I think, announcements, as part of the election campaign, that has been made, because, he's expecting to use tariffs to increase revenue rather than, tax. Now, I think for the last few years, globally, all companies, whether it's Chinese, non-Chinese, have been reevaluating, their supply chain strategies. From China, you always hear, this China +1, China's +N strategy, because, whether it's COVID, whether, like it's the geopolitical tensions have shown that, they need to really diversify, supply chain. I think this 2024 is one of the historical year with, many, many elections, and countries, like as a whole, need to really evaluate the trading partners, based on like actually sometimes these results, and often also national security concerns. So that has been also driving, right, a lot of the planning. We expect, well, Trump is also advocating also reduction in taxes, like to 15%, right, in US. That of course will affect a lot of companies that have global, businesses, their own tax planning. We also expect actually probably more M&A activities because, like with Trump, likely the regulatory approvals, like, for deals will be more relaxed, than probably under previous, administration. So this, again, will also drive, activities, which in some cases may divert, attention, right, of corporates, if where they spend, like their cash, like in, deals. So it would have definitely also impact, in the global south and, Asia. So that those are some of the key highlights. Again, we would refer you to, the alert that we have posted, for more information.
So the House view is CFIUS approval procedure will become easier?
CFIUS is, as you know, the US national security regulation. So Chinese going to US will continue to be difficult. And I think some of you might have also heard, US is implementing also a reverse CFIUS. So basically restraining US corporations, US nationals, like, with investments in certain sectors, AI, semiconductors, like in China.
Right.
So that kind of, restrictions, like, I don't think actually will be, relaxed, unfortunately. I think the bifurcation of, the two, powers, in sectors like, AI, semiconductors, that race will just continue and intensify.
But plenty of room for collaboration, right?
Oh, definitely. I think it has shapes, right, where people are setting up, whether it's manufacturing, R&D. It makes, planning actually much more, challenging because if you think about it, it's actually very global. Things like R&D, and supply chain, it's, actually very, global activity.
Now, you chair the, the Greater China office of Baker McKenzie. You head up M&A in this region as well. I want to learn the statistics on the ground. You mentioned China +1, China +N. Right, strategy of, apart from having a factory in China, have one, in another place, often in ASEAN jurisdictions. It used to be more of driven by maybe from some countries in the West, driving the supplier based in China to diversify. But is it more these days? Do you see another angle to this, like they more voluntarily do it, or what do you see?
Yeah, I do see interesting angle Look, China, let's take electric vehicles as an example. China is the largest market, for that, for automobiles and, EVs.
To make and to sell.
Yeah, and actually, a lot of global players, are suppliers, like, to, the EV makers, as well. The EV makers, as you can see, have expanded, in Asia, countries like Thailand, like, Malaysia, for manufacturing, and of course, like, in countries like Indonesia, right? Because, like, for also to expand, their sales, outside of China as well. In Europe, you see Hungary. You will see also Latin America, Brazil, like being recipient, of their investments, as well. But even global players, have been asked to go with, these Chinese supplies, because now global players, that supply, in the automotive sector, they're chasing all the Chinese customers. So that also has driven some of, our, whether it's US clients, like European clients, to think actually about their own manufacturing, where they need to set up, because there's a customer demand. So that's also, like something different, like, that you might expect that it's, like it's multifaceted in terms of, factors driving, like, these investment, activities.
Daniel, you talked about not a zero-sum game. Do you think part of multipolarity is supported by the fact that in supply chain management, it makes sense to actually actively and proactively establish networks of supply and distribution and manufacturing in different parts of the world, so we all win? What do you think of that?
Absolutely. I think we've seen, starting about 10 years ago, shortly after the global financial crisis in 2008, that a lot of manufacturing has migrated out of mainland China, as you mentioned, to ASEAN, to Vietnam, Cambodia, Bangladesh, and those places, plus also to Mexico to take advantage of NAFTA. So that kind of voluntary migration makes total sense in terms of strategic planning, because wages in mainland China have risen quite dramatically. So there is an arbitrage to be had in terms of taking advantage of lower cost labor in Bangladesh, in Vietnam, etc. So we've seen that, but we've also seen that the China supply chains remain, because for the more high-tech components in, let's say, electric vehicles, they come from China, mainland China. And so if you set up an EV plant in Germany, or a Tesla EV plant in the US, you're still getting components from mainland China. That's why I mentioned earlier, it's almost impossible to unravel the supply chain. You take the iPhone as another example, which is a classic example, where China supplies something like 17% of iPhone components, clearly not 100%, and you can assemble in other places, etc., to take advantage of certain multilateral trade treaties. But you can't unpick those critical components, and you can't replace them. Definitely not in my lifetime. I suspect not in the lifetimes of many people in this room. And therefore reality will set in. I know there's a lot of rhetoric going on inside the Beltway, particularly in relation to Mr. Trump's nominations for secretarial posts, etc. But just like the law of gravity always applies, I think the law of reality will sink in quite soon, that it's almost impossible. Then comes Mr. Trump's genius for striking deals, right? He is, as he tells us, the greatest deal maker in the entire world and the greatest negotiator in the entire world. And why should we not take him at face value because we've seen from both his first term plus his track record as a businessman through 6 bankruptcies that he's a deal maker, he's a negotiator. And we know that he has, or he tells us, he has very good personal relations with Mr. Putin, with Mr. Xi Jinping, etc. So I think once reality sets in, we will see a settling of the dust. So the rhetoric dies down a little bit, and we'll see some adjustment to the unavoidable realities of international trade and of the technological world. Now, only a fool would predict right now the exact details or the contours of that deal making, because nobody has a crystal ball, as far as I know. And therefore, I think we'll see some adjustment in terms of the global international trade architecture. We'll see some adjustments. We'll also see imposition of tariffs. I take Mr. Trump at his word that he'll slap massive tariffs on China. He says 60% generally, maybe 100% in specific cases, and 20% on European imports, etc. But I suspect we will get to a stage where creeping tariffs would impose equal pain on all suppliers, the United States. But the US consumer plus US manufacturers, which rely on foreign components, will complain. We see that already. In fact, many small businesses in the US which require Chinese input are already complaining that it doesn't work. This goes down to really fairly low-tech industries like clothing, not electronics. They themselves complain because they cannot stay in business without Chinese supplies. Let's say thread, let's say buttons, let's say cuffs, etc. So these are the small businesses that the Republican Party and MAGA, Make America Great Again, represent. These are the constituents of Mr. Trump's electoral victory. These people are complaining already. And that those voices will grow. So I think it's an interesting picture. It's a complex picture. It's not one-sided. I do firmly believe that reality will sink in and will reach some kind of workable equilibrium.
Thank you, Daniel. Elena?
I guess the one more moment that we can focus. These, trade wars is often in contradiction with the global agreements. Like, for example, in the Paris Agreement that all the countries signed. Every country has to do the best efforts to get an access to technologies for reducing carbon emission. And of course, when we're talking about these unique technologies that from China for electric cars and for vehicles that reduce emission, that is a big contradiction how to make a barriers for getting for the common people to such technology instead of with the effect of reducing carbon emission, definitely. And we see, like in Beijing right now, the fresh air. One of the reasons is this electric transport that appeared recently. So I think that one of the legal questions for lawyers who specialized in the international law, how these agreements within the international treaties is coordinated with the national policies, especially in trade, international trade.
Thank you, Elena. Do you think different systems of organizing social contract or country, such as capitalism or socialism, having differences in the way things are done in different countries, and you talk about mutual non-interference and self-respect, is there an impediment to growing a multipolar, peaceful world, or the opposite?
Let me attempt a first stab at an answer, and I'm sure there are many different answers to this. I don't believe there's any one country or economy or system that can claim to be pure or purist. So I don't think any one country would claim to be 100% capitalist, whatever that means. Or any one country would claim to be 100% communist, whatever that means. In fact, we see, in terms of reality, a spectrum. Many, many shades of gray. It's not black and white. And indeed, we see China as a prime example since 1979. So whereas China says it's a socialist country, but there are market forces at work with socialist characteristics. And therefore we see a blended system. I mean, that's the reality. So if you take away all the ideological labels, we see a blended reality where it's a mixture of market plus command economy. Now, China, of course, has received more than its fair share of criticism for state subsidies, etc. But look at Europe, look at the United States. Are there no trade subsidies? Is there no government support for oil and gas in the United States, for example? I mean, we know that the world is not devoid of hypocrisy, particularly the political world. And so we do discern, I think anybody with normal functioning brain can discern hypocrisy in full measure in many political systems. Therefore, as a citizen of the world or a consumer, we understand that we take a lot of these rhetoric with a pinch of salt. So I actually don't see, as to come back to your question, Nick, I don't see fundamental impediments to cooperation just because some country label themselves socialist or social democrat or Christian democrat or Republican or Democrat, whatever that means. And in fact, the Republicans and the Democrats have swapped positions. We know the Democrats in the US used to be the party for the working man, right, the blue-collar worker, whereas the Republicans were the party of fat cats. It's reversed. In fact, the reason why Harris lost the election is because many voters, the electorate feels that the Democrats have abandoned them. They have not addressed their most fundamental needs like job security, Medicare, and so on. Whereas the Republicans now claim, instead of being the party of the Wall Street fat cats, they are now the party of the disenfranchised, blue-collar, white, rural, farm worker or worker. So these labels are kind of fluid and interchangeable. And I don't want to criticize too many people because that's the nature of the game in politics. But we do know that labels are fluid. We do know reality has an inconvenient way of intruding upon ideological rhetoric, and therefore people will adapt. And your question, the 193 sovereign states members of the UN, can they not cooperate just because some of them call themselves different names? Answer is absolutely they can cooperate. And I see that cooperation widening and deepening.
Thank you, Daniel. A follow-up question, if I may. I mean, you're sitting...
Yeah,
please,
I'm just, can add that I also agree that sometimes absolutely the same procedures are called with the different names. I was born in the communist country, in the Soviet Union. I grew in the absolutely new Russia with all the democratic principles. And I see how efficient and how important became the social agenda right now, just to give people their quality of life, and you always need some social programs for this. But anyway, the 17 principles of sustainability that was managed within the UN organization, and they supported by all the members of the UN organization, always covers all these, you know, base principles of living: safety, safety, access to the food, to the tools, to the technologies, the combating with poorness, combating with the climate challenge threats, the basic security. So that these all principles, they cover coexistence, and doesn't matter how you call your principle within, but if your principle of managing of the state is going within the sustainable agenda, that is definitely the way of coexisting and peaceful living.
Elena, you talked about maybe your earlier childhood. So could you share with us, some of us here probably have not been to the Russian Federation recently. What is it like there? Is there, like the Western media said, dictatorship? You know, is there freedom? You know, is business thriving? Are you know, people looking at going global? What is it like there now? Business environment or living conditions?
Business environment is very good, because we work very hard on our legislation, on our court system, on our arbitration, on legal profession in Russia, on the capital market infrastructure within Russia. The country works hard. There are lots of outside challenges, but anyway, we can see that we have big interest from business from all over the world. And we opened ourselves maybe that the world is much more bigger than we used to think. And when we had this business council, BRICS working groups during all this year, when Russia headed the BRICS summit and BRICS conference, we saw the huge interest and huge collaborating. And I think when we will look through the signed declaration after the Kazan meeting, we will see that there are lots of important solutions that were found, lots of consensus that were found, a lot of new initiatives in the business sphere appeared. So I can just welcome everybody to come to Russia, to see it with your own sides, to get acquainted with the representatives of the legal profession, which develops a lot right now in Russia. So you're very welcome, and I will be happy to connect you.
And you are involved in the arbitration world in a big
Yeah,
way.
of course, yeah. And
You have
arbitration
2 big
was
conferences in Russia every year, is that right?
Yeah, I'm also arbitrator, and I'm involved in Moscow Commercial Arbitration Center, which is one of the oldest in Russia, and the very new modern arbitration center, Russian Arbitration Center initiatives. We have interesting researches within the Comparative Law Center. So we're trying to help with all the climate agendas, and are very much involved in preparation for the documents. We have some kind of interesting initiative like climate legal regulational club within the Comparative Law Center, which gather practically all big Russian business devoted to this COP initiative. So we have life in Russia still.
Do you welcome lawyers in this room or joining online from all around the world to apply to be on arbitration panels in Russia?
Yeah, very welcome. And we do have, fortunately,
So that
from
help
Hong
with
Kong,
multipolarity?
yeah, and from China, and from all over the world, really. And you're very welcome, and we'll be happy to present you our materials and our procedures and our regulation, and you're very welcome to be arbitrated with the apply. Yeah, thank you.
My early follow-up question meant for Daniel and friends is, first, I assume you're sitting here, you support the Belt and Road Initiative. Yeah, of course. And would you recommend for the US to also join the Belt and Road? And why have they joined or haven't they joined?
Well, I think everybody in this room knows that the US is not part of the Belt and Road Initiative. In fact, it's discouraged many countries from joining the BRI. But we're also glad to know that many of the efforts to discourage countries from joining have not been successful. Simply because many countries actually, particularly in the developing world, in the global south, find the Belt and Road Initiative beneficial because it could trigger foreign direct investment, inbound investment from mainland China, state investment, etc. So it's a path to prosperity. It's not obviously the only path to prosperity, but it's one of the major paths, and therefore the number of countries which are part of the Belt and Road constitutes, I believe, over 75%, maybe close to 80% of the 193 sovereign states which are members of the United Nations. So that's a massive majority of sovereign states which are members of Belt and Road. And Belt and Road clearly is synergistic with the BRICS structure, which obviously are the 5 major countries which form part of this particular bloc. Now, these structures are there to facilitate and promote investment and economic development and trade. They are, as far as I can tell, not political structures. They're not military structures. They're definitely not NATO. I mean, they're actually structures which address the very questions of development that the Global South feels is #1 priority. I don't believe any Global South country thinks in terms of necessarily joining military alliances as a first priority. On the contrary, that's fairly low down on the list. And it seems that economic development, economic well-being, promotion of health, longevity, clean water, sustainable agriculture is very, very high on the list, and therefore, not surprisingly, efforts to discourage countries from joining BRI have not been successful. In fact, on the contrary, BRI has grown and grown massively since inception, and I see that momentum as being maintained.
And we heard earlier from our keynote speaker, Mang Yang, talking about percentage growth contributing to the world economy. So if I jump a bit and ask about, to me, I would assume all would agree there's no doubt the rule of law contribute to building a more peaceful world. But precisely what are these rules and who sets these rules?
Well, I think there's a general consensus that rule of law is a good, right? It's a positive. No one would say rule of law is a negative. And whether or not we actually attain a system of perfect equity is a different question. But the aspiration to establish rule of law, to establish an independent and impartial system of dispute resolution, whether it's through national courts or through international courts or through ADR, like arbitration, mediation, etc. All that are uncontroversial issues, and I think there's general consensus that we want to move towards that goal. Now, obviously, just as Rome was not built in a day, utopia cannot be achieved in a day either. But just because we have not yet reached utopia doesn't mean that we should not strive, do our best to get there. I think the international legal system, which you could say goes back 4 centuries to Grotius, you know, back in the late medieval, early Renaissance era, is an attempt to arrive at a equitable, fair, transparent international system. Now, originally, international law was a means to regulate behavior or conduct between states. Now, of course, we know that it goes beyond states to individuals. Human rights law, international human rights jurisprudence is one dimension of this, which addresses issues pertaining to the individual and not just the state. And we see the many conventions which have been successfully sponsored, promoted by the United Nations, starting with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. All these structures and architectures built after the end of the Second World War is testament to the success of the system. And I don't think we can say that, oh, it's dictated by just 1 or 2 people. It's not. It's actually subscribed to by the majority of the sovereign states of the United Nations. So I think in that sense we can say it's been a success, but it doesn't mean that we should rest on our laurels and say to ourselves, okay, fine, we've done it, we can relax. It's not true, because rule of law is a constant striving for a particular principle, and there is no rest, as it were, in that effort to reach a rule of law just society. So you take, for example, the United States, which has always regarded itself as a beacon for human rights and asserting itself as the flag bearer for rule of law. I mean, has that country actually attained a rule of law nirvana? I don't think any American would even say that. And we know that it's a constant striving to maintain a particular standard. I think that the same applies to any country in the world. I mean, that is the nature of human nature. I mean, we backslide, we retrogress, but therefore it means that we have to be constantly vigilant to maintain that.
Thank you. Elena?
I think that the biggest danger that we do have, that this consensus on the rule of law unfortunately became just words with no substance. There is rule of law became just declaration, and everybody agrees that rule of law is very important. But unfortunately, today we see that law stopped to execute its main function, to regulate real relationships. And when we are looking, for example, for unprecedented sanctions programs, we see that that is nothing deal with the rule of law, because that is absolute antonym of the law. And what I really think that rule of law is really, really important tool for all the multipolar world and for solutions and challenges. And we have to do our best, but we have to stop just put these words as a label. We have to think deeper to the substance and to understand that if we do something without procedure, without right to apply, with the right to appeal, with a very strong restriction, without any sense and facts, that is nothing common with the rule of law. And rule of law now is a big challenge for the world.
Thank you.
I
Tracy?
want to pick up a point that Danny mentioned about being adaptable. I think what also we've seen that, look, the world's changing rapidly, whether it's politics, new challenges, like climate change, or new technologies, like AI. So it is also important, like that, globally, countries work together to actually change these laws, to adapt like to these new, challenges, and changes. Especially I think technology, we always say that, it falls behind, the law falls behind, technology. And look, AI shape now already what, how we do work, and will even change all, of our, what is clients, our own, even legal business, going forward. Europe, like for example, has, new AI acts, that, and I think companies that deploy, AI have already started to see how they adapt to it. These could, and if you think back, like, in terms of laws, like globally, GDPR, when data privacy was, the gold standard, and then, adapt. I think if countries actually can work together more in building these international standards, we actually, together can have better laws, that are more, I would say, like you can comply, and deploy.
Tracy, digital economy, green finance, is hot in investment these days, right? As people make these investments in the Belt and Road countries, what unique legal issues do you see, or other colleagues see that lawyers could help? And what should businesses do as well?
Yeah, maybe I highlight a couple of, I think common considerations, and challenges, that we see, especially in, the space you mentioned, digital economy, green energy. These days you heard, with investments, regulatory, heard that, a lot. One, as I just mentioned earlier, this is new, like the laws, still catching up. So you find yourself a lot of times in gray areas, and trying to, even debate, okay, is this, something that's subject to a license, or not, which, could have, of course, huge impact. It could, stop business, like if you don't actually, get this right. So I think understanding, navigating, like, those regulatory framework, like, if you go to a new place, I think that, is super important. Data privacy, cybersecurity. Globally, all countries are actually enhancing, having more stricter regulations, like on protection, storage, like use of data privacy. Again, it could drive structures. It could drive, actually even whether you can make an investments, or not. Because, like sometimes, like CFIUS, for example, in one of the deals we did, in a space where it's not even about, anything sensitive, but because the potentially where data, of politicians can be used, we have to structure a deal, like, or even carve out, certain assets. So these are honestly pitfalls that, like you may not actually realize. So having that sensitivity, awareness, and actually, at an early stage of the process of, an investment or a transaction, like understand that it's critical. I mean, when I started practicing, like when you do a deal, valuation, normally, like commercial considerations are the most important things that drive whether you do a deal or not. I think these days, a lot of, our clients would put regulatory almost as a threshold issue. It's, to see whether you can actually pull off, a deal. And, by now, I think especially, helping Chinese clients, they're quite savvy about jurisdictions that when, that could, have a link, and potentially could be, hindrance. I want to also highlight that, there are almost about, I think, 190 jurisdictions that have antitrust laws, in China. Oh, sorry, antitrust laws, in the jurisdictions. And antitrust, to me, is also one area that we cannot actually, well, we should also pay attention, because, like, the way laws, interpreted and they apply, you could actually, find yourself, having to make filings, for example, in jurisdictions that have nothing to do, with your current deal. So these are also, I think, pitfalls that people may not, realize. Cybersecurity, I think, is also another one with digital economy. I think in recent years, if you survey any, CEOs, top, issues that they're concerned, cybersecurity is also always, up there. So these days, do form, part of due diligence, when we look at, targets. I would just also finish by, one more, of course, very important issue is intellectual property. Whether it's, registrations, whether it's, understanding how, IP is owned, whether it's, self-owned, license. This, forms a very important, part, of assessing, a deal, and also implementation.
Daniel?
I'd like to add to what Tracy said, and of course I agree with what Tracy's observations on the areas we should focus on. But I want to emphasize that the green revolution that we're living through, and then I suppose we're at the beginning of this massive movement, is a $100 trillion transition. And that's the point I made in Baku on the opening day in my remarks.
COP29.
And COP29.
Conference.
Yeah, exactly. The Conference of Parties, which is the annual climate summit promoted by the United Nations. Now, that means that there's, to put it crassly, there's money in it. Now, why do I want to emphasize that? Because we all know that there's a limit to what you can do to make the world a better, safer place by moral admonition alone. If you can demonstrate there's money in a proposition, people do it. It's just self-interest. And that's a very powerful motivator. Now, it doesn't mean that we're all going to pile into the green revolution and invest, impact investing in EV cars, do carbon trading, etc. But it does mean that there are huge economic opportunities there to be deployed. And a lot of money is piling into the green revolution. There's also, of course, the regulatory dimension Tracy mentioned, that we want to eradicate greenwashing. We don't want to just label something green and have people pile into it, or companies advertising themselves as green, when in fact they are just pretending to be green. So verification is very important. I mean, that's a key element of the auditing of the process, which lawyers are well equipped to do. And of course, in terms of the amount we need to spend to reach carbon neutrality, we are actually spending, we have a spending shortfall of $4 trillion per annum. So that, what does that mean? You can say, well, that means it is impossible to get to carbon neutrality. But on the contrary, I would say that means there's huge opportunity for growth. And that's a point that in COP29 we all accepted. And therefore, in arriving at a net good, which is carbon neutrality, there is money to be made. And I want to emphasize that. So it's not just everybody posing or pretending to be a green warrior. Actually, the fund managers, private equity, the investment bankers, the lawyers, the consultants, the accountants, they will go into this industry in a major way, because this is the new economic opportunity, which will be with us for quite a few generations and will last for the rest of the century.
Thank you, Daniel. Elena, do you agree?
Yeah, I absolutely agree, and I'd like to add that there's really unique opportunity, and Gazprombank last year was the first in Russia issuer of green bond of the bank, which was verified by the Chinese verificator. And that was also very important movement that started, and that is really within the international collaboration in this field. And I can say that this year, Gazprombank also was in charge, was involved in the very important deal that appeared. So the first carbon units from the climate project in Russia was sold to the company from Emirates. That is also the beginning of the big market cause and the opportunity for lawyers, for verificators, for those who work with the capital markets. And that is really not the push, that is motivator and the opportunity. I agree. But I'd like to add one more issue, very short one, that is, I think, important for innovative economy. We have some simple things. For example, we still don't have the unified e-signature standard and requirements of the national trust services providers. So it means that in the future, in the very near future, that will be a big problem for all the e-commerce, for all the international relationships, because everything goes to the digital sphere. And every nation has its own standards, own signature, and the Mercury rule does not satisfy the modern requirements. And that is also one of the fields of the really work on it, so for innovative economy.
Thank you. Do you guys see a possible harmonization of different ESG standards around the world?
I think we're seeing a movement towards that, and that for the very simple reason that we need to do it. We need to arrive at common standards, and what we're doing in Hong Kong, for example, hopefully will facilitate that target. So. Let's take carbon trading as one example, which is very topical. China, we know, mainland China, is the world's sole remaining manufacturing superpower. Now, as a manufacturing superpower, clearly there are many practices in Chinese manufacturing which are detrimental to the environment and which need serious addressing. So, what has China done? China actually started carbon trading in 2008, 16 years ago, way before many other countries, definitely before Hong Kong. We never even knew what carbon trading meant, but China started this in Tianjin in 2008. It set up a second carbon market, Beijing. 2009, a third carbon market, Shanghai. 2010, today, there are 8 different carbon markets in China, plus one national market. Now, what do they need to do? They actually need to interface with the most mature, deepest carbon market in the world, which is that of the European Union. How do they do it? They can only do it via Hong Kong. Why? Because Hong Kong has a very deep market, not in carbon, but generally, and it has a world-class regulatory, transparent environment. It has the rule of law, has an independent judiciary. European Union is very happy to work through Hong Kong to harmonize with the China carbon markets. Beijing, the entire ecosystem, carbon trading ecosystem in China, is very happy to work via Hong Kong to reach that particular goal. And Hong Kong also leads in another area, which is that the Hong Kong government made the first public issue of green bonds, which is earlier this year, first in the world. There's a world's first. Also, it issued the world's first tokenized green bonds. And that is a step which will lead to a cascading of green financing revolutions starting here. So as a Hong Kong person, I'm very proud of that. As the Vice Chair of the Financial Services Development Council, I'm also proud to say we played a small role in making that happen.
Huge role.
Yeah, and so yeah. I think we see that as a new wave, and I think Hong Kong can be very proud as a very small place with a little over 7 million people, a tiny drop in the ocean of the world's population. We have actually made a significant contribution.
So because of time, can I open the floor for questions from the floor? Anyone would like to raise a question? Well, Elaine, can someone pass the mic to Elaine, please? Thank you. Name, company, thank you.
Elaine Lo from 今天工程律师事务所. Daniel, I'm very excited to hear about what you said about what China is doing with the carbon trading markets. I'd like to know more. And you mentioned that Hong Kong is in the best position to interface between China's carbon markets and the EU carbon trading markets. In what way can we contribute to this effort? Because I think that carbon trading has been very active in China for quite a long time. But we in Hong Kong simply are, well, maybe me, I personally am quite ignorant of how we actually go about doing this. If you can enlighten us.
You asked a very good question, Elaine. We are newcomers to this, let's be honest. Because Hong Kong has been hollowed out as a manufacturing center since the 80s, since China opened up with the four modernizations in '79. Hong Kong businessmen and industrialists were first movers. We moved our manufacturing capacity into the Pearl River Delta, taking advantage of cheap land, cheap labor, etc. And then we moved up into the Yangtze, lower reaches of the Yangtze Valley. Now, not being a manufacturing center, we never looked seriously in Hong Kong at carbon trading, but knowing that there is a need for harmonization and knowing that the European Union respects and trusts the Hong Kong markets, we are starting to set up a carbon trading center here. Now, it's an embryonic proposal. There is a paper shortly to be published. It'll be published early next year by the Financial Services Development Council on this very question. So I'm not telling you it's already operating. It is not. But we will see significant movement next year. We know that the China carbon markets are fragmented. The different cities have voluntary carbon emissions trading. There's also a national market, but the national market was only set up this year. So it's all very new. And given the nature of regulation in mainland China, there's an element of uncertainty, maybe lack of trust, as between the European Union and China as to what's going on. So there's no commonality of view and of implementation and of verification. This is where Hong Kong can add value because of our rule of law. And although we are newcomers to this, we are very fortunate that mainland China, in particular, Beijing, is foursquare behind us. They want to support us in this, and the different carbon markets in mainland China want to support us in this. So we are actually meeting not just no resistance, on the contrary, we're meeting enthusiastic support. Now, it's a work in progress. There's a working group which I chair on carbon trading, and it involves major participants from carbon trading institutions in China, particularly the Beijing Green Initiative, they were also present in COP 29, and they were there in COP 28 too, which was in Dubai last year, where for the very first time, you know, Hong Kong was given a voice. Now, I think this is worth mentioning because this is significant. Hong Kong is not a sovereign state. We have no status in the UN. We are not a member of the United Nations. We're not a sovereign state. Therefore, for a long, long time, we had no voice. But last year, with support from Friends of the Earth and with the blessing of the central government, Hong Kong, the delegation I led, were given blue passes, which means official passes. So we spoke in the China Pavilion last year, and we spoke in the China Pavilion in Baku this year. Now, that's a huge breakthrough. And if you just get your media feed from, let's say, the Financial Times or the New York Times, you're not going to get this sort of news. But this breakthrough, Hong Kong being given a voice in the United Nations, happened not before 97, it happened after 97 with the blessing of the central government. So that's a very positive development for Hong Kong. It's a win-win. It's a win-win for us, for China, and I dare say also for the United Nations. We have a lot to offer.
And ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening, and thank you for participating. And please put your hands together for Elena BORISENKO, Daniel Fung, and also Tracy WUT. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you. And we're going to present some souvenirs.
Thank you very much for the insightful discussion. I'm sure that all of us have useful takeaway from this section. May I now invite Mr. Chan to present souvenirs to the speakers as token of appreciation. Let us also welcome President Tong for a group photo with the speakers and moderator.
The discussion of session 1 ends here, and we have now come to the end of our morning session. Please remain in your seats, and the appetizers will be served shortly as we move on to the luncheon and its keynote speech.